You're the first people to see a presentation based on this project. And one beneficial aspect of that is it's still early enough to benefit from your comments. And I thought that this might be the crowd for something a little more ambitious and theoretical. So the motivating puzzle for this project is the motivating paradox is that South Asia has some of the weakest states in the world, very low levels of legibility, persistent insurgency, sort of a weak monopoly of coercive force by the state, and very low levels of public goods provision. These are all symptoms, as it were, of this underlying problem of what political scientists call weak states. At the same time, South Asia has some of the most pluralist states in the world. And conventionally, that's pictured as sort of democracy, that many states in South Asia have been democracies for long periods of their history. I conceptualize pluralism as something a little bit broader, the idea that the state is influenced by a broad segment of society. And so if you think about the ability of elites to influence South Asian bureaucracies and South Asian governments, even authoritarian ones, as I think I'll show later in the talk, is remarkable. So this is showing kind of long-term averages, population weighted for across regions for state fragility, kind of a well-known cross-national metric, and polyarchy from the VDEM data set across world regions. And South Asia is on this odd frontier here. So in the manuscript, I say South Asia has the second weakest states in the world after Africa, and is the second most democratic region in the world, 1950 on, after Europe. And those are things that, so each of those dimensions would be interesting in and of themselves, could motivate a whole research agenda. The two of them together are especially interesting. And they're especially interesting to me because, to my mind, some of the smartest people in all of the social sciences have focused on this problem of weak states in other regions, and they've come up with theoretical solutions that are, for different reasons, not very convincing for South Asia. So let's start with where Gautam started, with Charles Tilly. So Charles Tilly is usually quoted as sort of a bellicist theory focused on war. But it's a theory, in essence, about demand, that state building is based on differences in demand for state building. War creates this dire need for resources. And when there is a dire need for resources, states create institutions to collect them, attack bureaucracies, et cetera. And so Western Europe, in the early modern period, lots of war, strong states. And the rest of the world didn't have as many wars, or had the wrong kinds of wars, and so they get weak states. Now, but let's think about South Asia. South Asia has had lots of wars and lots of international rivalries that might plausibly motivate governments to create state institutions. So the kind of long-term Cold War, occasional hot war between India and Pakistan is what perhaps comes to mind. But you can also think about the participation of the Indian colonial state in 2 world wars, raising the largest volunteer army that has ever been raised during World War II, having a level of militarization that is unprecedented for colonial states, or the various interstate wars, because that was what they were, that occurred in the 18th century between the various Mughal successor states and the rising empire, and then the relentless military expansion of the Mughal Empire itself. So there's been quite a bit of conflict in South Asia. But it has not led to Tillian state building. And even when you look at the details of democratic state building in South Asia, it looks very different. These sort of urban elites that play, who rulers are forced to negotiate in Tillian theory, don't play such a big role. Okay, so if Tilly is sort of the leading theory for what goes on in Europe, Jeffrey Herbst is the most cited theory for what goes on in Africa. So this is a theory about trade-offs, that when state building is expensive relative to the returns you get in resources, it doesn't happen. And so in Africa, low population and rough terrain increase the cost of state building. And so states concentrate on the capital and don't govern most of the rest of the area. Now, there's a problem putting this to South Asia because, yes, there are certainly mountains and jungles in South Asia, but many areas of South Asia are very, very densely populated and very, very flat. So if you're saying no people, no state building, which is what, or no water, no state building, which is what Herbst often comes close to saying, South Asia is extremely anomalous. So Bangladesh is close to the most densely populated country in the world and close to the flattest country in the world. And yet it has one of the weakest states in the world. So what the hell is going on there? Also, for Herbst, states are always predatory, but as we've seen, South Asian states are pluralist to a remarkable degree. Finally, there's Harvard's Anya-Hua Wang, which unfortunately could not make it, who has a theory of politics of East Asia, which is based on social networks as kind of the key independent variable. And his idea is that imperial China rulers traded low state capacity with local elites for stability. So they kept the networks of local elites small, which meant that there couldn't be coups, but also meant that there couldn't be state building. And this, I think, has some ties to other comparative theories of state building that focus on social ties or social identities. Well, as we'll see, this story has many things for South Asia. You can probably think about elite networks that undermine state building in South Asia. But there's not this trade-off. Stable authoritarianism is not really how you can describe contemporary South Asia. So clearly, indeed, the social terrain is not really exogenous overall. It's shaped in the long term by the state. So what do I think is going on in South Asia? So I think there are these three challenges that rulers face. So just as a setup, there are revenue maximizing rulers. They are working through agents who can be professional bureaucrats, can be feudal lords, you can call them what you want, as we will see. They want citizens to pay taxes and follow their orders. But there are three things that stand in the way of kind of perfect compliance by the citizens. So one is what I call the problem of control, and that's the one that maybe you've heard the most about. So can agents monitor and coerce citizens? So do the bureaucrats know what the hell is going on? Do they speak the language? Can they understand the practices? Can they estimate your income? Can they even get to the village where the population is residing? However, there are also two other problems. One is what I call the problem of motivation, which is leaving aside whether the agents can control the citizens, can the ruler control the agents? So if we conceptualize this as a rural society, even if, say, the agent is living in the village, knows everything, understands everything, everybody's afraid of them, what's to stop the agent from going rogue, from keeping the taxes for themselves and lying to the ruler and saying, yeah, that's all there was? And perhaps even from setting up on their own. Then there's a third problem, which I call the problem of motivation. Oh my God. So the problem of motivation is the third one. The second one is the problem of monitoring. Excuse me. This is a problem with the slides. So the idea there, unfortunately, is that the even if you have perfect monitoring of everybody, ultimately you face an upward limit, which is the lack of quasi-voluntary compliance. You can't monitor everybody all the time. And if people aren't properly motivated, they will give you less than their full effort, and you'll get less than your full potential revenue. So which of these three problems can states solve? So in the book, in the chapter, I developed this idea that there are four basic ideal types of states. One, which I unoriginally and possibly misleadingly called failed states, are states that are unable to solve any of these three problems. So agents can't control citizens, rulers can't control agents, and nobody is motivated to follow the state's commands. So that means that states are predatory, but they're very weak. And they're concentrated in the capital city on natural resources and on foreign aid. And without revenue, you're kind of stuck in a trap because investments in institutions are possible. So you could also think of these as sort of Herbstian states. A second type of state, which you're going to hear a little bit more about, quite a bit more about in the course of the talk, are what I call integrative states. So these are states that can solve the problem of control. So the agents have influence over the population, but not the problem of agency. So the state has no control over the agents. So what ends up happening is you have big, delegated, hard to control state structures that subvert the ruler's goals. So the elite has a lot of power, but the ruler cannot properly control the elite and get it to do what it wants. So these are a product of bargains between rulers and elites, where the ruler trades, says, okay, I will accept only superficial compliance. I will accept that you're going to cheat me and take a cut of revenue. In return, the elites provide local expertise and power when the state needs it most. And these bargains can be formal. So if you think about princely states in South Asia, indirect rule in general, venial office holding, so the purchase or sale of office, or even elections. These are all arrangements by which the state formalizes the idea that someone other than that they who appoint has a right to political power. But you could also do this more informally through clientelism, through lobbying. So even if on paper you have kind of a perfectly functional bureaucracy, the elite can enter that bureaucracy and pursue its own goals or sort of suborn the agents. Another type of states are what I call disciplinary states. So these are states that can solve both the problems of control and the problem of agency. So everybody is monitored, and that means that states are strong and autonomous. Their limitation, however, is their lack of quasi-voluntary compliance. So people obey because they have to, but they believe, not inaccurately, that their efforts are going to help the ruler rather than themselves. So when it's possible, they cheat. So one feature of disciplinary states is they try to make up for this by propaganda. The ruler loves you. The ruler has everyone's interests at heart. But ultimately, individual cheating is a major problem. So civic states, the last category, have solved all three problems. And they do that by giving citizens a role in the government, which leads to strong quasi-voluntary compliance. So instead of just seeing propaganda that the ruler is acting in your interests, there are actual institutional guarantees that taxation will be spent on public goods that help them. So these lead to strong states controlled by civil society, and formal and national bargaining between social groups and institutions, not the type of informal and local bargaining that occurs in integrative states. So that's sort of a theoretically driven way of conceptualizing these four ideal points. A more traditional way, based on their outcomes, would be to see it as two dimensions of autonomy and capacity. And yeah?
No. Yes. I was not trying to interrupt.
Okay, please. Failed states, high autonomy. The ruler can do whatever they want, but they can't do very much. Integrative states are interesting because there is low capacity and low autonomy. The state can't do very much, and it is heavily influenced by elites, and so on. And I've put in brackets regions of the world which I see as kind of vaguely conforms to these ideal types. So if you look at the influence, the experience of specific countries or specific periods, you can definitely quibble with any one of these. A third way of conceptual organizing these ideal types intellectually would be to say, okay, there are elites everywhere. How are they integrated into the state? So in failed states, there's no integration. In disciplinary states, they're integrated as individuals. In integrative states, they're integrated as networks. And in civic states, they're integrated formally as civil society. So different ways in which elites get a role, which leads to different levels of influence and thus different levels of autonomy and buy-in. Now, where does this come from? So this is, all of this has sort of been kind of describing variation that exists. So where does it come from? So I focus on three sources of variation. One, which I take pretty directly from Herbst, is costs. So less dense populations and rugged topography make monitoring and coercion more expensive. Secondly, differences in capital. So if you have money, you can invest in institutions, to use Wesley Pearson's terminology, and create these structures. In particular, however, mobile capital is much more vulnerable to this quasi-voluntary compliance thing. So areas and high levels of capital have unique opportunities to build states, but to fully take advantage of them, you need to negotiate with capital holders. And then finally, there's time. So in order to kind of build strong states, to develop this monitoring and coercion, both of elites and of society, you need some time free of crisis and instability. So you can think of it as, okay, so one of the key things often talked about in building a strong state, say, it's creating a national language. And that's like, you have to change the behavior of millions and millions of people. That takes centuries. It took China centuries. It took France centuries. And every time there's a crisis, those efforts are disrupted. Similarly, developing a tax bureaucracy is something that takes quite a bit of time. It involves creating records, which you can then refer back to. It involves, at the lunch, we were talking about how you create incentives for individuals in the bureaucracy to spend their whole career in the bureaucracy and focus on the goals of the institution rather than their own individual institutions. So with centuries, you can do that. If you don't have those centuries, if, say, there's an immediate crisis like a war, that will encourage kind of quick and dirty bargains with states, with elites. So in the long term, you might wish to get rid of these people. You might wish to reduce the level of social diversity and embedded social power you have to deal with. But if you need the money now, you'll give them power. You'll give them a formal role, and that becomes very difficult to claw back later. To walk you through, yes, go ahead.
So can you just go back to the previous slide?
Absolutely.
So you're trying to explain here just the coercion and monitoring functions of the state, right?
Yes,
And these are your independent variables.
that's right.
Okay, but got it. But we think of the absence of war being a product of state capacity, right?
So as you'll see, I try to focus on factors like kind of big geopolitical factors that I'm arguing are exogenous sources of conflict and crisis.
Right.
Obviously, internal wars are in some sense a product of your ability to solve these problems. Yes.
Yeah, I have a question. So I remember you referenced the U-Haul. Actually, the classic from back in your guy, but I just wanted to ask, like, I think like the framework that he provides, like that's more for like these stages. I was curious, like, though you referenced it, like, you know, I don't think like there's a lot of issues like applying it to South Asia. So I just want
I think that in itself is interesting.
Okay.
And like, I mean, and that would be the plea of all three of the brilliant scholars I just referenced is, look, I'm trying to explain this thing it doesn't travel. But that's, on the one hand, that's an opening. You can say, well, South Asia is not explained. We need a book on that. The bigger way of saying that is, well, to the extent that political science, social science is trying to make develop big generalizable laws about human behavior that can travel across context, the fact that things don't travel very well tells you that we need to expand them, develop them, smash them together and see what fits. Okay. So failed states, I argue, are a product of low levels of density, low levels of capital, and low levels of conflict. And I think if you think about it for a second, you can kind of see where that is coming from. So monitoring and coercion are expensive because of the lack of density, and the rulers don't have any money in. So rulers focus on a small area that they can personally observe. You might say, well, okay, why low levels of conflict? Because if conflict was high, they would get gobbled up by some larger state. But if conflict is low, very weak failed states like this can maintain themselves. So integrative states emerge in zones of high population density, high conflict, and low capital. So in theory, because of the high density, monitoring and coercing the population are possible, but war and crisis means that rulers don't have the time, and the lack of capital means they don't have the money either. So they make bargains with local elites, and these bargains become hard to get out of. And later in the talk, I'll give many specific examples of what these bargains look like in the context of South Asia, though a smart crowd like this, you're probably already thinking of some of them. So disciplinary states, this is where East Asia comes in, are the product of high population density, low levels of capital, and low levels of conflict. So you have the centuries to grind down the elite's resistance, to habituate them, say, to civil service exams as a method of elite recruitment, to habituate them to a national language, to habituate them to a national religion. So even without money, over time, in a kind of a macro perspective, you can develop a strong state.
Is that the standard reading of East Asia?
No, it is not.
That there's low levels of conflict in East Asia?
I would say, yeah, I will defer to experts. I would say the revisionist account is no. East Asia has a lot of conflict.
Yeah.
Traditional accounts were yes, low levels of conflict, perpetual Qing peace. I don't buy into those, but just to anticipate, I argue that there are two big kind of geopolitical explosions, which are extremely disruptive just to state building projects in a lot of areas. So one is the Muslim expansion of the late medieval period, and one is European colonialism. And it's not quite that East Asia is completely insulated from those movements, but it gets them in a more attenuated form than South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa do, just purely because of distance. So it's not that people aren't fighting, it's that these like massive out of area advantaged and coercively technology people have a hard time getting there. And so they're spared that particular type of geopolitical trauma.
And what about low levels?
There is actual data attached to this later on, but my argument, which that is in line with the econ history consensus, is that South Asia was very poor and East Asia were very poor relative to Europe going back to the early modern period. So we started in 1500, right? That yeah, I'll show you some data on this later on.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think first Ptolemy.
Ptolemy, yeah.
I mean, while we're discussing these categorizations, I was curious about the failed state argument as well, because it's not just Africa. Many places in India can be categorized.
Yes. Yeah. We'll get there. Yeah.
And another question, so when we talk about the states in South Asia, what period are we looking at? Is it the contemporary state, or was South Asian state weak in say 1800 compared to the European state?
This is, again, a point I'll get to, this is a pretty broad thing, so I'm arguing that kind of the motivating variation is in the contemporary period, and I'm making it like the data I showed you, that's all about that states are weak now. However, the argument also extends, I think, to the colonial and local periods, so that states were weak then. There's less quality cross-national data at that time, so it's hard to make a comparison like in 1800 were they weak. But the argument I'm making is in this period, you had this integrative state solution in South Asia, and these bargains were created, and that has created a path to dependence that makes states weak now. Now, whereas, say, in Western Europe, you had a different set of bargains with capital holders that led to the civic state equilibrium. Whether in their early stages, they were really all that different, hard to say. But definitely the trajectories they've been put on leads to measurable differences now. Emma.
Slightly different question. I'm trying to figure out, like, maybe preview what the bargains may be with elites. And you said national languages, religions habituate elites. So this seems like something you want to habituate mass publics to, rather than.
So disciplinary states are able to habituate both, right? So, and that's why they can solve both the problem of agency and the problem of monitoring. I think I mentioned that first because I had a picture of a civil service exam in China, and that's an example of elite habituation.
I had a different on Gautam's actually.
Yeah.
You know, there's an entire book by Victoria Bonhui, which is about Tilley in East Asia.
Right.
And it's basically the same. So, you know, I'm just kind of like, I just feel as if, to me, when I think about war in East Asia, the kind of state of the literature seems to be that there actually was a really high degree of war. And in fact, that is what was responsible for the creation of exactly the type of states, which might not be against your argument. But you know.
So my recollection of that book, and it's been a while, is she's talking about the Warring States period.
Your recollection is probably better than mine, but what I
Yeah,
have
so
is that it's Tilley in East Asia, right? Like.
But this is like a millennia before the period I'm talking about. So to the extent that I'm talking about East Asia free from conflict, I'm talking about the Ming and Qing, right? Where you just have that one dynastic transition. Whereas before that, oh yeah, there was this whole period of time. But yeah.
And that's the period in which you get homogeneity in language and tax collection, bureaucracy and stuff, is it?
It's the period where it reaches its. Well, I actually, usually when China people talk about this, they focus on the Song, which is the period right before that, as kind of the period where, like, those things reach their apotheosis. Yeah.
But I guess many would even argue
Yeah.
that national language isn't really sorted until the early decades of the PRC, which is when Mao kind of begins to kind of do.
Well, at the elite
the
level,
homogeneous.
at the elite level, it gets sorted by the Song, right? Like, so to the extent that everyone's taking this exam, they're they're habituated to this common written language.
Right, at the elite level, that's right. But then I guess that gets to Emmerich point, which is to what extent is this also a problem, or not a problem, a challenge, I guess, of taking it to the masses. But you know, we should continue. Sorry, we went.
Yes, see, this is all about how crises disrupt efforts to build things. I'm attempting to build this argument, and y'all are rushing in and disrupting. It will take me years to rehabituate you. So civic states emerge in zones of high conflict and high capital. So the availability of capital gives you this golden opportunity that's not available in the other conditions. You can afford to build institutions, and because of war, you need to do this. But in order to tax capital, you have to bargain with capital holders, and so you get these representative institutions. And that, if you were to try to do it in a table, that's what that would look like. So for our purposes, it's this high density, high conflict, low capital. That's what I'm trying to convince you of in South Asia. Before I start to try to do that, as Ptolemy suggested, I've been throwing around really rather loosely the term South Asia and making generalizations about something called South Asia. So how can I do this in this enormous and enormously diverse region? I think it's worth kind of getting out of your head two myths that are very embedded in how Indian elites think about themselves and how people conceptualize, and therefore how people conceptualize modern South Asia. Indian elites believe that their state is uniquely strong and uniquely pluralist, and that's based on two comparisons. One is relative to Pakistan. So no doubt all of you have seen comparisons like that: India, the democracy; Pakistan, the failed state, the authoritarian regime, etc. And then there's the historical comparison that contemporary India is uniquely democratic, uniquely effective relative to the patrimonial, pre-colonial and colonial regimes. So without getting, there's sort of two empirical claims I'm trying to make here, and on kind of the validity point. One is just there's a lot of internal variation in South Asia. Most of the rest of the talk is going to be about showing you internal variation in South Asia, but it doesn't actually line up that well with the 1947 borders. So if you come in and say, yeah, it's going to be a comparison of India and Pakistan, I think you're going to make the wrong generalizations in general. And then secondly, I'm going to argue that this pattern of relatively weak states and relatively high elite corporation was evident long before 1937. That was true of the colonial regime as well, and that the independent variables I've mentioned, density, capital, et cetera, those differences were also evident well before 1947. Okay, so the geographical legacy in South Asia is sort of what's shaping this. So within South Asia, you have actually it's kind of got out of order. So this is sort of the cross-national information. This is all from the Madison data set. So density, South Asia really stands out. Along with Western Europe, is one of the most densely populated places in the whole world. And that's evident from a very early period. Kind of riverine agriculture in South Asia can support a lot of people, even relative to East Asia. GDP per capita, on the other hand, is another story. So it's in some ways a small graph because you can't see it. The only places that are in the two highest categories for wealth are the Netherlands here, right? So in 1600, you have a world where Western Europe is taking steps ahead of the rest in economic development. And if you ignore all the missing data, which should also tell you something, much of the rest of the world is very close to subsistence levels. And that pattern has only become more pronounced since then. Within South Asia, the population density is concentrated in the Indo-Gangetic Plain. But there is also this very lightly populated periphery around it. Then, if you kind of take a geographical perspective, there's a sort of central location where it's exposed to what's going on in the Middle East and Western Europe. In essence, if you are a European colonizer sailing around the world, you get to India first. And so there is a century, in some ways, almost a century and a half of exposure to the geopolitical pressures of European colonialism that you do not get in East Asia. This leads to kind of three broad zones, which you're going to see in a lot of the data in this talk. So one is what Ptolemy was mentioning earlier. There is a zone of generally on the periphery of South Asia, where there's very rugged terrain, very light populations, and states are historically weak. So if it was just that, I think a Herbstein story would work. If you just look at those regions, I think a Herbstein story would work for South Asia. But where it gets interesting there's another zone, which is essentially the Indo-Gangetic Plain, which are dense, very dense, flat, actually very flat areas where states are exceptionally weak. So these are the areas which are spatially, in a human sense, in a cultural sense, are at the core of South Asia as a region, and yet the core is wrong. These are places where states are exceptionally weak. And these regions, I think, are why you need a theory like this and why you need to talk about integrated state building as a source of weakness.
So these are weak today, but not necessarily weak in, say, 1870, right?
I will show you they were weak in 1872. Yeah, this is I'll actually show you they were weak in 1590. Like this is a long-term pattern. So where are South Asian states relatively strong? Well, there is this set of moderately dense areas, generally kind of semi-peripheral valleys, that were a little bit insulated from Muslim invasions, to a lesser extent from colonialism, where indigenous states and legible societies develop. And these areas, I think, are as close as you can get, which is not all that close, to a counterfactual of what South Asian states would look like if these big geopolitical interruptions had not happened. So I've talked a lot about, in the context of integrated states, this delegation. So what do these bargains look like? There's a lot of different forms. So they could take the form of sovereignty. So the bargain is based on the fiction that the local elites have some sort of political control that transcends and predates the ruler. So that's what the princely states are about. That in some sense is what the federally administrated tribal areas in Pakistan are kind of based on a similar fiction. You could, on the other hand, give people property rights in the state over tax collection. So that was what zamindari tenure was about. That's what hereditary village office holding, which still continues in many parts of South Asia, were about. It could take the form, more conventionally or respectably, of creating elected local officials and giving authority to them. Or it could take the form of kind of informal intermediation, what we call state capture in the contemporary literature. So let's see what this looks like at different time periods. So the Mughal Empire was, to an almost absurd degree, delegated its governing power and delegated its revenue collecting power to local elites. So you have these zamindars, local landowners who have armies and collect taxes from the peasants. But those taxes, for the most part, don't go to the treasury. They go to mansabdars, to Mughal aristocrats who receive jagirs from the government, who collect the taxes in return for service. And in many cases, actually, indigenous princes are sort of integrated into this system by being this sort of pretense that they're jagadirs, but actually it's just they sort of keep their kingdom and pass on a little bit. This is the so-called Vatan Chagirs. So one, I think, right in terms of order of magnitude calculation, is that 82% of the Mughal state's revenue was consumed by the aristocracy. Like just very, very little gets to Delhi. For me, that seems kind of low, actually. If you had to talk about it, and if you want to talk about what happens in the central bureaucracy, where there's all kinds of patrimonial rights as well, even less. This picture here is the oldest Mughal document available from 1527, right after the Battle of Panipat, and it is a grant of tax exemption for a village right outside Delhi. Like this is the constitutive act of the Mughal state, is issuing farmans to people saying, govern this, and in return, give us that, right? I've heard Mughal Empire being described as an entrepreneur of power, right? Someone who is in continuous conversation with local elites, giving and taking, taking kind of pledges of fealty, and in return, accepting a lot less than what is theoretically the full revenue potential of these areas. Yes.
I was really struck by the 80% figure, because I went to India Business Conference at HBS, and they said that like 7 billion control 70% of the wealth in India. So I thought, wow, that's like a very historic thing that had changed.
Yeah. So yeah. I mean, that's yeah. Elite intermediation is alive and well. What did it look like in the colonial era? So you can probably think of some of the forms it took. One is princely states.
That's a question.
Yeah.
So the zamindars also have their own armies?
Yeah.
So it's not just jagirdars who have, and mansabdars who have.
Yeah, and we're talking hundreds of thousands of people. So in the Anil Akbari, they're all listed,
Yeah,
like the armies of the zamindars, like exactly how many elephants, and they're actually much bigger, less capable
Mhm.
than the imperial army because they're all part-time, but much bigger.
how are these different from barons and lords and stuff in medieval Europe?
They aren't.
Okay,
So they aren't in their local role. What is different, and what I think leads to the different trajectories, is in Europe, and this is where Yehua's work comes in. Barons have sort of a class solidarity, and they develop class institutions that eventually bargain with rule, right? There are parliaments, et cetera, and that never really develops in India. So the sort of local grant system from the Middle Ages evolves into a system of social bargaining. Whereas in South Asia, it persisted.
Okay.
You seem dissatisfied.
no, I'm not, continue.
Okay, so as I'm sure no one in this audience needs to be reminded, over a third of South Asia is ruled by princely states. So Indian families who are given kind of fictive, not fictive, legal semi-sovereignty over areas and hardly have to pay any money at all to the central state. Even in the pink areas, the areas where there's direct rule, in many cases, the British delegated rights of tax collection and law enforcement to local landowners. The so-called zamindars in Bengal through the infamous permanent settlement, and they had money to build lovely Italianate houses in Kolkata like this one. Now, even in the areas that didn't have princely states or the permanent settlement, you have extensive delegation to hereditary headmen, patils, village accountants, right? So this isn't the riot warrior areas, right? All of these people who have formal roles, they're to some extent independent of the state in how things are administered and how revenue is collected. Urban elites are integrated through elective institutions, a more modern feature. Today, we have a similar spread in how local elites are brought in. So in the frontier areas, things still look a little bit old-fashioned, right? Jirgas of Pashtun Maliks still are kind of the key decision makers in those areas. And in a few areas, you have insurgent groups that have a formal relationship with the state. In many areas of Pakistan and a few areas of India, you still have landlords kind of doing as their ancestors did. And kind of, if you want to access the state or the state wants to access the citizens, you have to go through them. Local political bosses or mafias often play the same role. Even in areas where, there's not quite these very obtrusive elements of intermediation, as you all know, like South Asian bureaucracies are often regarded as captured or sent or subject to brokerage. There's huge literature in the South Asian context on clientelism and brokerage, that how citizens cannot directly access the state. They need elites to do it for them, and elites take a cut in return for doing it. So in a few cases, you can trace these changing types of brokerage over time through one family. So this is the Rajas of Badri in Pratapgarh district of Uttar Pradesh. So they start off as zamindars for the Nawabs of Awadh in the 18th century when we first hear of them. And they're sometimes collecting taxes for the Nawabs, sometimes fighting with them and getting killed, sometimes getting imprisoned. Violent bargaining here, refused to pay, fort besieged, and then killed. Then the British come. And, turns out they're just as necessary to the British as they were. So neatly playing both sides of the 1857 rebellion. Then once the British regime gets more stable, they are Talukdar, sort of a grand form of Zamindar. British control starts to look shaky. Okay, time to get in with the Congress. You can see Baran Bahadur Singh here with Nehru. This is their fort. And then finally, the man that most of you have probably heard of, the current representative of the family, Raja Baya, who is the boss of Pratapgarh district, the mafia leader of Pratapgarh district, but also has a role as an elected official, as a state legislature. So what you can see is the Badri family has been playing this game for a long time. So using their power in Pratapgarh to get power in Lucknow, and using their power in Lucknow to get power in Pratapgarh. And using their relationships with people in Pratapgarh to become valuable in their relationships to elites in Lucknow and beyond, and back and forth. And there's also a mix of tactics here, a mix of law, a mix of democracy, a mix of violence. The mix has changed over time, but it's still there, and the family is still somehow manages to stay on top and rich. Their persistence in one family is unique, but the argument of this book is the persistence of this class is not over time. One final sidelight before we move on to the data is on the role of identity here. So when the Badri family goes out to campaign, they're spoken of as Rajput politicians. And when the British talk about them, they're spoken of as Rajput Zamindars. So there are many small ascriptive groups in South Asia, castes, communities, sects. And so these are bigger than the kin groups that Yahuwah talks about, but they're not national in scale. They usually have some sort of regional base, and they're not usually even a local majority. So I'm interested on how he would think of these groups like this. So they are within his kind of network framework. So they're useful to local elites, these identities. So they link them to peers in other regions, and they link them to their clients. They provide a counter narrative to state propaganda. The need to have solidarity with your caste can counteract propaganda about how you should have loyalty to the central state. And they provide a framework for making claims against the state. You owe us Rajputs something. They can also be useful to states in that they help elites with the help of elites, they can mobilize soldiers' money and votes. And interestingly, in the Mughal period, in the colonial period, in the contemporary period, these identity categories become how central states think about these elites. They categorize them based on their group affiliation as loyal, deserving, martial, always fitting them into these categories. Backward. Okay, so now time for some data. Yes.
I'm curious, when you talk about caste and like sex, are you just putting that in the context of South Asia, or is it?
Okay, great question. Yeah. So this is all I'm saying here is small ascriptive identity.
Okay.
So I wrote 2 books on the politics of caste, and the more I look back on it, the more I put too much emphasis on the word caste and the idea of hierarchy. So lots and lots of these small groups would describe themselves and be described by others as caste and be somehow linked to these ideologies and these notions of ritual hierarchy, but lots of them aren't. Lots of them aren't even Hindu. Lots of them have very ambivalent or even hostile relations to the hierarchy, but in a political context, they're functionally similar. Something like, if you're talking about Maharashtrian politics today, Buddhist is a category. You can see it in the CSDS service. So this is a group that is there because it is a religion that was founded specifically on the rejection of caste. by a segment of Maharis, but it has become a social category that elites appeal to. You see,
Well, so what's the connection of this description to your theory? What's the point that you're trying to make in this context?
this is a slide I added yesterday. I have not thought fully about how it links to the other elements of the theory. To the extent I can, I would say that like the local elites, the state has an ideology in this theory, or tries to, like, do what I say, because God told me, because we have a civilizing mission. And so there's a question of what is the ideology of the local elites to push back, and maybe that's an answer to this question. Maybe it's raising questions it can't answer. So I look forward to answering that question.
Oh, I was going to add, I think like the reason I brought up that it's not just like South Asia, but like you look at like say Korea, for instance, there's a like informal caste system, right? And then
And I tried to my book, but everybody's like South Asia caste South Asia, like it's just
culture, like
yeah.
there's no official caste system, but like people look at each other through like style. So I think like applying that like I'm trying to say.
Just a clarifying question, before we actually move to the data, so then, I guess I'm trying to be clear about the argument for why there's local elites in, say, like if you take East Asia, South Asia, and Western Europe, there are local elites that exist in all these places, and we're saying that, what exactly has sort of caused divergent pattern between South Asia and what is different in South Asia and East Asia, and then South Asia and Western Europe? I guess
Yes, what is different is between the key thing in the context of the theory is in this levels of conflict. So during colonialism, say, the British are desperate to take over the country. They don't have enough men. They don't know really anything about the context. Their culture is completely alien. So they start cutting deals right and left with local elites, with princes, with zamindars, with whoever will play. And these elites become embedded in the state in a substantial way that does not happen in East Asia. So in East Asia, the Qing or Ming states have the leisure to say, you know what, shut up and take the exam. Like independent principality, ha ha. Like,
okay, so that's
Yeah.
helpful. Conflict is one thing. Does this link in any way to this idea of like individuals and networks? Because
but because the people taking the exam are from these families, right? So instead of being called, so if we kind of take the Badri family to China, they wouldn't get to have a fort. They wouldn't get to have this whole Talukdari administration and their own private army. They would get to participate in the state bureaucracy, right? So instead of having this whole, it's not quite an institution, it's, I think a network is the right term for the group of people and interests around them. You know, they're still ambitious people seeking power, but they're doing so on a smaller scale.
So.
Yeah. Yes, so it's an interesting question because formally, of course, South Asian bureaucracies, at least for the past century and a half, have had this very Weberian flavor to them, but informally, there's all these ethnic quotas and clientelist networks that are going on under the surface. That's a weakness of the current argument, is like is kind of documenting and theorizing how elite incorporation occurs within modern bureaucracies. But specifically because it's informal, it's harder to show in the way that friendly states are, you know. Okay, so I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs that are state capacity relative to population density, different periods, different measures. And it's important when keeping this in mind to see if we were kind of taking a Herbstian theory to South Asia, what would it look like? And it would look like up, 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 right? More dense, more taxation. If anything, only because there's more people to pay taxation. But that's not actually what we see. This is taken with much work and a few heroic assumptions from the Anil Akbari. You see that it's a curvilinear relationship. That actually Bengal, Awadh, this rotten core in the Indo-Gangetic Plain have lower levels of taxes per assessed acre than other areas.
Why do some of them appear like multiple times?
These are districts and the labels for the Sarkar, for the Subak, for the province. Because I thought it would be weird to have like a million district names, some of which are very long on the graph.
Okay.
So wait, what did the two Ajmers, for instance, mean? Like one.
Yeah, so these are Sarkars within Ajmer Subak. So these are essentially districts within what is now Madhya Pradesh.
Ajmer is Rajasthan.
What? Oh, sorry. Roger. Well, the Ajmer Sarkar extends a little bit into Madhya Pradesh.
Oh.
Yeah. Actually, a little bit into Punjab. But yeah, you're right. Sorry. Malwa is Madhya Pradesh. Okay, this is so this does not have this problem because it's at the province level. And again, you have this slightly curvilinear relationship. This is what in theory should be the best measure. So this is in theory what everybody has to pay per acre. This is how much you can actually collect in your best year during the reign of Aurangzeb. And you can see again Bengal falling off, Delhi, the capital, perhaps predictably the highest. So you have some areas that kind of fit the Herbstian framework, less densely populated, peripheral, Kashmir, low, but sort of this rotten core, though the data is terrible here.
Heard also say something from like the distance from capital, or are you accounting for that distance from the center of power in Bengal, right? So in Bengal, like the outskirts, and that's why it goes down.
So I thought about that for a bit, trying to incorporate that. The problem is it's just so endogenous, right? And the Mughal capital moves all the time. So if it was really important for them to collapse in Bengal, I mean, it would be the center, right? Yeah.
But I'm trying to say that is there a optimum population density here that is high beyond which there might be different things going on, like maybe happening a lot of like slum, like for instance, like we maybe seen in cities in India, a lot of like illegal things happening, increasing the population doesn't give you on a point kind of swing taxations, like what will happen.
Yeah, so to the first part of your question, yeah, I'm saying that there is an intermediate, right, level of population density, which in this particular context is optimal for taxation, because where the problems of covering distance are solved, it is profitable to build institutions. There are enough people to tax, but there's not so many people in such a dense network of local institutions that the local intermediation starts to take away from it. And yeah, slums are a great example of an area that should, in theory, be easier to govern, all these people per acre, but because of the local intermediation, it's hard for states to do that even now. So this is another measure, more institutional measure. So how much of the land tax was directly assessed by the central revenue bureaucracy versus kind of guesstimated? And you can see again, there's this curvilinear pattern, higher at intermediate levels of population density. This is unfortunately 1931 population density, so take it with a grain of salt. Under the British, you see a similar pattern. This is again at the district level, a curvilinear relationship between population density and administrators per capita and land taxation per acre in 1931. Right, so So again, this part of the graph, not so mysterious. This part of the graph, a lot more mysterious. Why are these areas that should be easy to govern from kind of a purely technocratic perspective so hard for South Asian states to govern? Similarly, if you look at it institutionally, so right Wari tenure, which is as close to as the colonial state gets to a direct relationship with the population, is highest at intermediate levels. Direct rule, also at slightly higher intermediate levels.
And this is not just a function of wealth, right? Meaning it's not just that Bengal is poorer per capita than.
So I would dispute the contention that like in the colonial era, Bengal is poor per capita. Like certainly it's the area where all the industrial production is going on. It's the area that's exporting the most.
Okay.
But that is something I need to address. Just to go back. So let's imagine that Bengal was wealthier. Well, then it should make it easier, right, to collect a lot of land taxation per capita. So this is even though the land is pretty fertile, and suppose maybe it was wealthier. Yeah, I don't know. Like the
No.
I'm sorry. Okay, because usually I get the opposite version of this critique. Is like Bengal. This, you can grow anything there. Like, and actually that's going against it. I'm sorry.
So your claim is
brain
basically
freeze.
that the local aristocrats were just consuming
Just
more.
taking it, yeah. And for this particular graph, like that's very, very well tested. Right, the British knew this was happening because they freaking guaranteed that taxes would never change in an area where the currency is inflating.
And they did that why?
They did that in the 1790s because they wanted the zamindars on their side. And they thought that they would create a loyal class of aristocrats, just like back home in India. And they did, encourage some social stability in Bengal, but they created this sort of what everybody at the time, even in the colonial administration, viewed as a parasitic class. Right. So yeah, the problem in 1931 is that they're paying high 1790 tax rates that can never be changed. Yeah.
Wait, sorry. I just want to make a quick suggestion.
Yeah.
If we could just let Alex finish and then ask for say question at the end.
Okay.
Samosas outside, everyone.
The most is outside.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. I will skip this slide. Okay, so this is contemporary. And here you can see it's not even curvilinear, it's linear. The more dense your population gets, the fewer state officials you have per capita. Right. So this is sort of the pattern we're more familiar with.
Sorry, what on the y-axis?
The y-axis, so this is log state employees per capita in 2017, and this is log police per capita in 2017. Thank you. And so you can see again the familiar kind of weak state candidates, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, et cetera. One nice feature of these graphs, I wasn't able to do it for all the graphs, is I was able to integrate other South Asian states and their subregions into it. And you can see how well it fits, right? That, Sindh is there, Baluchistan.
Wait, I don't understand that. I thought these were in your periphery.
What?
These are the weak states.
Isn't that interesting, right? So what's happening here, I think, is that the state is consciously backfilling these peripheral areas because it knows it's weak there. So this isn't, not to get too technical, but this is an input measure of state capacity, right? So they're putting employees and police there using central revenue, right? In the India context, these are all special category states. And so they've been able to actually reverse it. Now, where you start to get the curvilinear thing again, I will get there. Is where you start to look at measures of effectiveness. So this is census accuracy. I calculated the Whipple index, which is basically how much rounding there is in people's ages in the census. And you can see, no surprises here, Bihar, most census inaccuracy in India. The numerators are just making it up. But it's sort of, again, an anti-Herbstian story. The less dense you get, the more accurate your census gets until you get to the very end where you get this curvilinear thing. Similarly, with the measure of elite monitoring, which is teacher absenteeism. So the lowest percentage of attending teachers is in West Bengal, Uttar Pradesh, but again, more of a curve on your better. Hold on. Yeah.
Wait, sorry, I want to enforce this a little bit.
Okay. Okay. I also said something about how conflict is something that encourages deals with local elites. Well, what did that look like in the colonial period? So this is data from my job market paper on basically, was there a war in Europe at the time your region got annexed? And this is the sort of critical juncture. And at times there's a war in Europe, the East India Company is under financial pressure. And as you can see, right-wari tenure is much more likely to be introduced in European peacetime than in European wartime. And even a century later, land taxation is higher in areas annexed in European peacetime than in European wartime. Further evidence on the same point. So this is categories from the Census of India. So categories that might vaguely track state capacity. So the proportion of workers who are in state administration or the police, higher in these peacetime annexed areas. Categories of census workers that we think might track elite intermediation, estate managers and lawyers, higher in areas annexed to wartime. Again, this is just showing that zamindari tenure is associated with lower state capacity, just a kind of a detail. This is showing the same thing. So this is what I'm talking about. Like, you can go back to, with Gautam's earlier question, you can go back to like any period of colonial statistics, and the state is weak in Bengal and Bihar. Because a lot of functions that are discharged by centrally paid officials in other regions are discharged by the zamindars. The centralized police forces start a generation later in Bihar and the north of Bengal and the northwest provinces than everyone else. Field by field land registration doesn't happen until a generation afterwards. In fact, in Bengal, it doesn't really happen because why? The taxes are always fixed. You don't need to do it. So just these very, very striking differences across regions in state capacity in the colonial period with these very densely populated areas that are doing poorly. Wanted to show there's been a lot of propaganda, well, not propaganda, scholarship, whatever, on how great princely states were in terms of welfare provision. Without prejudicing any of that, I think that more benevolent, perhaps, in fact, probably, but lower state capacity is the descriptive pattern in princely states, and this was a pain in the ass to calculate. This is essentially a metric of census inaccuracy in 1921, and it's substantially higher in the princely states. I've been struggling a bit to come up with formal measures of elite intermediation or the degree to which elites don't play by the center's rules in the contemporary period. Here are the best two I could do. This is the percentage of PDS funds which are stolen in 2005 and criminal MLAs, and you can see that areas with more intermediation appear to have weaker states, just as a descriptive thing. That's just an implication of the theory for which you can find some data. Same thing with census accuracy. I haven't talked much about democracy or pluralism here. That's a part of the manuscript that's a little underdeveloped at this point. But I wanted to point out that these areas, these densely populated weak state areas, are areas with remarkably high levels of political competition. And that's something that's kind of weird from a political economy perspective. You know, they have more effective parties, no lower levels of turnout, et cetera. So I just wanted to flag that. And I think it's tied more broadly to this idea that pluralism is something that can occur at the same time as weak state building. But I don't think I fully fleshed it out enough yet. Yeah, so this is going to be a book. It's, so what I presented is mostly from chapters 2 and 3. Later, I'm going to talk about more historically about how various state builders have tried to solve these problems and what they've run into, more on global comparative data and comparative data, and more on kind of what the normative consequences of this are, because they're by no means unclear. Thank you. So sorry to go on.
So much, Alex. This is super interesting. And, you know, as all of us, as the engagement kind of shows, there's a lot out here. And so just in the interest of time, I'm just going to try to just say, look, this is a really exciting project. I think you're onto something. And so I'm just going to try to do whatever I can to try to be most helpful for you. Okay. So in that vein, I guess I remain a little puzzled still about what the puzzle is. And, you know, in the title, you say, it's the tragedy and the paradox. And I guess I'm still a little unclear. What exactly is the tragedy? Is the tragedy the paradox? Does the paradox explain the tragedy?
Suck at titles.
No.
Like,
deeper
yeah, this is book
question.
6, and I haven't gotten good at titles. Like, this is.
You know, I think the title always comes at the end, once I think you've got the argument down. So I wouldn't beat yourself about that.
Okay.
I think I have other stuff for you to kind of get through first. So, the one is that it's a little bit of a terminological soup right now, right? And I think all of these, the title, the labels, the terms, to me are kind of indicative of a kind of broader thing that you know, just like all books needs to get sorted. So, you know, that very first graph that you had, where you begin. And so I just want to also start by saying that most of my comments are really based on Alex's paper, which I'm not sure was widely circulated, but is similar to the talk, but is also a little bit distinct. It doesn't have any data. So most of my comments will be on the kind of conceptual side, which was in the paper that I read. So you know, you begin in the very beginning by mapping on the y-axis polyarchy. And so if you go right back, right, like that very first slide that you showed us was polyarchy versus fragility.
I'm gonna ask a Colorado question about the crushing. So part of the argument is that strong groups lead to integrative states.
Yeah.
But then in answer to a question that Gautam had about like what's the difference between Barons and Lords and Zamindars, you're just like one developed class consciousness and formed parliaments, and then the other they did not. But it seems to be that the state bargained with these groups as groups, right? To cohere these groups in ways that created them, and now that there's a problem of trying to crush them.
Yeah, so so the distinction I'd like to make is between individual bargains that you're making with elites in particular regions. So, okay, you get a Furman tax exemption. You get a slightly different Furman, and like these are individual contracts which have all these kinds of differences. Versus let's all meet in a parliament and have like a Magna Carta which says generically what the state can and can't do to different types of nobility instead of each one having a contract. Now, of course, in England, every noble had an individual contract too, but gradually over time, the societal level contracting becomes more important than the individual level contracting. You seem confused.
I'm confused, but there are many more questions. So
okay, I'm okay. I'm so sorry. Okay.
Very well formed, but your argument seems to be that different in India and from other societies is the way elites are incorporated into the state building process, right? And it's different from talking about like these 3 categories of state, and what you're trying to do is explain state building, right? So what I understand to me is the distinction between the local state versus local elites. Because you could have an Awadh where the local elites are keeping the taxes to themselves, and they might be quite effective at collecting those taxes, which would mean like a strong bureaucracy, but it doesn't then transfer to the central state. So you might have strong subnations, but not a strong central state like in the case of China. And that makes me think about, you know, like McDowell's argument about strong societies and weak states. And what was the reason why, the barons didn't get together, like in the case of Europe? Like we could imagine all the zamindars having some sort of a class consciousness, and that did not develop. And it makes me wonder about the role of caste and whether that's where the resistance comes from. To continue to maintain traditional hierarchies and not have the state interfere. And that is kind of like, where this
Mhm.
left versus right argument in India is mostly about the role of the state in not disturbing traditional social hierarchy, right? And maybe that goes back to the Mughal times as well. And the only other exception that I can think of is Paul Kenny's book. And their state capacity is strong because of this almost competition between the colonial state and the Travancore.
His first book, right?
I think so, yeah.
The one with the Myanmar case.
I mean, I remember the Travancore case where like the argument is that if you think about state capacity in terms of patronage, there's only one case where patronage is not the defining attribute of the state, and that's Travancore, and that's because the king was forced to develop this bureaucracy and social development, so that doesn't get taken over by the British, right?
Let's gather a couple more questions.
Okay.
A lot of
Yeah,
Josh, okay. Yeah, we'll go.
The logic that they're doing is that they talk about state building, but never about the drivers of state building. They take out politics out of the equation, right? And so they take out really talking about what exactly is it that the people who are in the state or governing the state want and how they build the state, right? And so this comes back to colonialism, that when we put in Mughals and colonialism and all these periods together, we're looking at very distinct rulers who want to create states in distinct ways, right? And so Tilly has this more recent article about the third world and colonialism, and that colonial states have more capacity in military, right, and in coercive apparatus, and they don't necessarily have it in like development or something along those lines, right? And there's an underlying assumption in the whole of your argument, right, that the more dense the state is, or the state always wants to build itself and wants to do better. But is that really true, right? Like when we look at the British were not interested in improving literacy, they were interested in law and order. And when we look at like all these like archives and reports, actually their law and order apparatus was actually very effective and had a lot of information, but they just were not interested in improving the literacy or adding that part of the capacity, right? So when you look at structural factors, you kind of miss the politics of it and why certain people are building states in certain ways.
One final question.
So going back to like what Gautam said at this point about these Mughals and like why they developed a similar class consciousness in India. I was thinking of can Pomerantz's argument of like this great divergence, and if you could comment on like whether there is a role of in your theoretical framework, whether there is a role of the Western Europe having these sort of outlets of land or people or industry in different locations, and that so when maybe the class consciousness develops not due to lack of conflict, but because there is a common interest in conserving these monopolies of say East India Company or of slave trade. So when like I didn't see in your theoretical framework how this Western Europe is linked to the underdevelopment of these three different the rest of the blocks.
Okay. First on Clemens' question, so a lot to unpack. So the first situation you articulated where like local states and local networks can surveil very well, but the central state doesn't know what's going on. So that's how I see integrative states is forming, and like the Migdal tie-in, that's totally right. Where it gets tricky, and I think you were right to bring up Travancore, because Travancore is exactly where it gets tricky. Is right now I have this division between central states, which are doing the monitoring and local elites. I mean, even the Badri family is pretty small scale in the grand scheme of things, who are doing the disrupting. But what if the local elites got kind of big, kind of controlled half of a whole region, and their patrimonial administration and networks became a formal bureaucracy? And that's kind of what happened in Travancore. So Travancore is just a very big, local family that had a lot of stability. And so, yeah, Travancore isn't paying a lot of taxes to the central British government, and not at all to the Mughal government. But they have this, what they have is not it looks kind of like a state, as we would describe it, and not like a patrimonial thing. So there's that kind of weird case that if a local elite gets big and powerful enough, they can become a ruler, and you can cross that line. So I need to think about that. Your other question, which you also brought up, this question of class consciousness, why nothing in common. So I think, and what the theory is trying to articulate, and what I think the historical record shows pretty clearly in the Western European case, is parliaments aren't being called because the barons have this class consciousness and they get together and they get angry. They get called because the ruler wants money, and he thinks that those tax demands are going to be more legitimate if there's a bunch of elites in the room to do it. And only once that happens do all the barons get together and say, actually, yeah, we do have this common interest. And in some sense, their common interest would be presupposed by being they're all being asked collectively. So I think that if the Mughals had for some reason decided to call a parliament, you would have got aristocratic self-consciousness pretty quickly. They would have discovered how much they had in common. In fact, they had quite a bit in common, Persian culture, all this, but that didn't happen. The Mughals preferred to negotiate with them.
Why?
Individually. Because the argument is, which is still maybe a little imprecise and ill-formed, is that they're trying to tax mobile capital. And so having that legitimacy is really necessary if you want to tax capital, in particular, because you're not just inviting the aristocracy to these parliaments, you're inviting urban communities. And so
in Europe, they're trying to tax
in Europe.
mobile capital.
Yeah.
And in South Asia, it's sedentary capital.
Yeah, it's just agriculture straight up. And so you try to do it through monitoring, because let's face it, these parliaments are a real pain. Once you have them, you only do it if there's a really nice possibility.
But striking a bargain, hundreds of landlords at once is a real thing too.
It is, but at least formally, these are highly asymmetric bargains, right? You have all the power in each dyad. The problem is you don't know where they're going to cheat you. Okay. Your question about what does the state want and why it's different. So let me, there's sort of a semi-cop-out answer, which is, I think, pretty conventional in this literature. So I'll give you that, and then I'll give you a more kind of hot take kind of answer too. So the cop-out is, look, it doesn't matter what the state, what it is. States, you're absolutely right. States have very different goals on how they want to spend the money. But in order to get the money to do whatever it is they want to do, they have to do a few basic things. They have to be able to collect taxes, and they have to be able to maintain a basic level of internal stability. And so those are sort of core aspects of state capacity in the ways that others are not. And so that's what you want to focus on if you're doing any kind of comparative account of state capacity, is sort of taxation and legibility. And that's what I'm trying to do in the data. So saying, let's focus on that. If I was looking at, say, literacy rates, absolutely right. All those critiques would apply, because you would get into different goals rather than the capacity to achieve those goals. The slightly hotter take version is, I have always been slightly skeptical of the idea that the colonial state kind of was just a small government. enterprise. There were some kind of really crazy things they did, like this trigonometric survey of India, completely unnecessary, but very central to their legitimating ideology. That railroads, massive overinvestment, but central to their legitimating ideology and important to their supporters. And then you can say the same thing about welfare for contemporary regimes, important to the supporters, important to their legitimation. But in order to do those kind of fun or politically beneficial things, you have to do these basic.
Can I do one follow-up to that?
Sure.
Isn't it a understanding that in South Asia, there's no income tax or you don't tax the elite, and that's why you don't get to, right? There's a bargain, an unspoken bargain between like the state and it means that you won't demand too much of us, we won't demand too much of you. That's this, and it kind of applies this.
Yeah. I mean, this is, yes.
You won't tax you won't say anything against us, we're all on the same page, right? So the taxation itself is like, will we tax you or not, is like a kind of political decision. If we won't tax you, then you don't like ask anything of us, and then we're right, you can control us, but not demand. But I
agree with that. I mean, that happens in all South Asian regimes that bargain. But there's another part of the bargaining too, which is how much of the money from other people's taxes are you going to get, Mr. Ali? I mean, it's sort of unspoken that you're now in the Mughal or colonial cases, those negotiations are happening at the same time, right? Because what zamindars are doing is they're bargaining to pay a set amount of money, which they will get to collect from some other set of people. So typically they own some of the land themselves. So the negotiation about how much tax you pay and how much salary you get as a tax collector are kind of bundled together in that sense. And maybe that's why I'm not making that distinction clear. And then finally, on your last question on the role of colonial outlets, yep, that's not in the theory. It should be. I need to think about that question.
I have a last, can I just say one last
Turn
thing?
on the floor.
No. I just actually realized that, if I told you that the puzzle, I actually have an answer for you because I realized that. If the question is why doesn't like population density and all of these other factors explain it, right? Like what explains why it is that they don't? I think that answer is what kind of Gautam was pushing you on, and that last slide that you yourself added. I think you're getting to the answer. I think it has some other point about nation building. I think it has something to do with identity, and that would link very well with your previous work, right? But I'm just saying that I think that's kind of where you're getting to it. It's like something kind of prevents Tilley and Herbst from being right in South Asia. And I think what is kind of countering the expectation has something to do with that slide that you added this morning. But I think that's
Yeah. I mean, you just have to be very careful because that's kind of traditional colonial account of South Asia, which is they're so caste ridden they can't do all this great stuff that we can do. So you don't want to say that. I don't think that's right.
I guess my question is